The Ozark Triplet witches who lured single men, then used them for dark purposes. That's what a dying judge wrote in his secret journal, hidden for decades, in a Missouri courthouse. 35 men, all unmarried, all vanished, without a trace in the mountains near Copper Hollow. Railroad workers, timber cutters, traveling merchants, men who thought they'd found love with the mysterious Hartwell sisters. But love wasn't what waited for them at the isolated Springhouse. It was something far worse. The townspeople whispered about screaming in the night, about men who went willingly but never came back, about a breeding program that turned human beings into livestock. The sisters called it their higher purpose. The community called it silence. One woman called it murder. But when an entire town protects 3 women who collect men like cattle, what happens to justice? And what really happened in that Springhouse? The October wind carried the smell of decay through Copper Hollow, Missouri, as Sarah McKenna stepped down from the westbound train onto the weathered platform where she'd said goodbye to her childhood 12 years before. The town hadn't changed. The same cluster of wooden buildings hunched against the Ozark foothills, the same suspicious faces peering from behind lace curtains as the circuit judge's daughter returned home for his funeral. But Sarah had changed, and she could feel their disapproval settling on her shoulders like dust from the coal-fired locomotive. Her traveling dress was too fine, her posture too straight, her eyes too direct for a woman who should have been properly married and settled by now. The house on Elm Street stood exactly as she remembered it, though smaller somehow, diminished by years and her father's absence. Judge William McKenna had been buried 3 days ago. She'd missed the service, delayed by floods that had washed out the railroad tracks east of Springfield. Mrs. Henderson from next door had pressed the key into Sarah's gloved hand with barely concealed relief, muttering something about, "Finally, someone to deal with all those papers before hurrying away, as if death itself might be contagious." Inside, the familiar smell of her father's pipe tobacco and leather-bound law books brought tears that Sarah had been holding back since receiving the telegram. William McKenna, aged 58, found dead at his desk of apparent heart failure. No signs of distress, no indication of illness, just gone as suddenly as a snuffed candle. Sarah had taught children in St. Louis for 6 years, had learned to compartmentalize grief and function through crisis. But standing in her father's study, with his coffee cup, still sitting beside his inkwell, she felt like the scared 12-year-old who used to hide behind his judicial robes when court was in session. It was while sorting through his papers that she found the journal hidden beneath a stack of case files, bound in cracked brown leather, with a lock that opened at her touch. He'd always trusted her with his secrets. The pages fell open to entries dated just weeks before his death, written in her father's careful script, but with an urgency that made her hands tremble as she read. September 15th, 1873. Another one gone. Thomas Garrett, the railroad man who'd been boarding at Mrs. Crawford's. She says he left without notice, took his wages and headed west, but his belongings remain untouched in his room. That makes 35 now. 35 men, all unmarried, all last seen in the company of one of the Hartwell sisters. Sarah's breath caught. The Hartwell triplets, Charity, Faith and Hope, lived on the old Morrison place near Willow Creek, where the natural spring bubbled up from deep in the earth. Everyone knew them as healers, midwives, the women you called when the doctor was too far away or too expensive. They delivered half the babies in Copper Hollow, tended the sick with their herbal remedies, and asked for little more than food and gratitude in return. Strange women, yes, unmarried at 40-some, keeping to themselves on that isolated property, but hardly threatening. The journal entries continued, each more disturbing than the last. Her father had been keeping meticulous records, noting patterns, tracking disappearances that others dismissed as men simply moving on to better opportunities. September 20th, visited the Garrett boarding house again. His trunk remains filled with personal effects no transient worker would abandon. A darioip of his mother, his father's watch, letters from a sister in Ohio, who writes regularly asking why he stopped responding. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages, finding lists of names, dates, detailed observations about each missing man. Her father had been conducting a secret investigation, documenting evidence that painted a picture too horrific to believe. The final entry, written just 4 days before his death, made her stomach clench with dread. God forgive me, I should have acted sooner. The Springhouse holds secrets that damn us all. If something happens to me, Sarah will be the only one brave enough to see this through. The truth must come to light, whatever the cost. The next morning, Sarah made her way to the modest white church where Reverend Mills had presided for nearly 20 years. She found him in his study, a thin man with nervous hands, who'd always seemed uncomfortable with the weight of spiritual authority. When she mentioned her father's journal and his concerns about the missing men, the Reverend's face went pale. "Your father was a good man, Miss McKenna, but grief and age can affect the mind," Mill said, his voice carefully modulated. "Sometimes we see patterns where none exist, especially when we're struggling with our own mortality. Those men your father was concerned about, they were drifters, seasonal workers. It's natural they'd move on when the work dried up." But his hands were trembling as he arranged papers on his desk, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. Sarah had spent years reading the faces of children trying to hide mischief, had learned to recognize the tells of deception. "Reverend Mills, my father documented 35 disappearances over 3 years, all unmarried men, all last seen with the Hartwell sisters. Surely that deserves some investigation, Miss McKenna." His voice took on a sharp edge she'd never heard before. "Your father was respected in this community, and we'd like to keep it that way. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for the deceased is let their final struggles remain private." The Hartwell sisters provide essential services to this community. They've saved more lives than I can count, delivered babies, tended the sick, whatever your father thought he saw. The study door opened suddenly, and Mrs. Mills appeared with a tea tray, though Sarah hadn't heard her approaching. The woman's eyes darted between her husband and Sarah with unmistakable anxiety. "Reverend, perhaps Miss McKenna would like to visit the ladies' auxiliary meeting instead. We're planning the church social, and some stones are better left unturned, Miss McKenna," Mrs. Mills interrupted, setting the tray down with hands that rattled the china. "Your father was a fine judge, but even fine men can become confused in their final days. The Hartwell sisters are good Christian women who help this community. Perhaps it's time you return to St. Louis and your teaching position." Sarah looked between them, seeing the fear they couldn't quite hide, the way they glanced toward the window as if expecting to be overheard. Her father's journal had contained more than just names and dates. It had documented a conspiracy of silence, a community willing to look the other way as long as their own families remained safe. Standing in that small church study, surrounded by the symbols of moral authority that had failed to protect 35 missing men, Sarah felt her grief transform into something harder and more dangerous. Her father's final words echoed in her mind. The truth must come to light, whatever the cost. She understood now that she was the only one left who might have the courage to pay that price. The next 3 days took Sarah through every boarding house, tavern, and shop in Copper Hollow, following the names in her father's journal like breadcrumbs through a dark forest. She began with Mrs. Crawford, the widow who ran the boarding house where Thomas Garrett had stayed. The woman answered her door with flour-dusted hands and suspicious eyes. But when Sarah mentioned she was settling her father's affairs and needed to verify some records, Mrs.
Something resembling living quarters, but living quarters designed for captives rather than guests. Heavy iron rings were bolted into the stone walls connected to chains that bore the stains of long use. Strange symbols were carved deep into the rock, not Christian crosses, but something far older and more primitive. Spirals and interlocking circles that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. But it was the evidence of habitation that truly terrified her. 3 crude beds lined one wall, their straw mattresses bearing the impression of recent use. Personal effects were scattered about. A man's work boots, a torn shirt, a pocket watch that Sarah recognized from her father's description of Thomas Garrett's belongings. In the corner stood a wooden table covered with bottles and jars containing what appeared to be herbal preparations alongside metal instruments that looked more suited to veterinary work than healing. "You're trespassing on private property, Miss McKenna." The voice came from directly behind her, calm and cultured, despite the late hour. Sarah spun around to find Faith Hartwell standing not 10 feet away, carrying a lantern in one hand and what appeared to be a small derringer in the O'Crawfordess expression, softened into practiced sympathy. "Poor Thomas was such a quiet man," she said, leading Sarah into a parlor that smelled of lavender and loneliness, kept to himself mostly, sent money to his sister, regular-like. Then one morning in August, just gone, left his trunk, his work low, everything. I kept thinking he'd come back for them, but she shrugged, the gesture carrying months of unanswered questions. Sarah had learned to ask the right questions without seeming to probe. Had Thomas been courting anyone? Mrs. Crawford's face brightened at first. Yes, he'd been walking out with one of the Hartwell girls, the pretty one with the shy smile. Hope that was her name. Dodd, such a sweet thing, always asking after his health, bringing him little posies and such. He was smitten, talked about maybe settling down permanent. Then one day he went calling on her, and that was the last anyone saw of him. The pattern repeated itself with sickening consistency. James Morrison, the timber cutter who'd been sweet on Faith Hartwell, vanished in June after speaking of marriage proposals. Daniel Webb, a traveling merchant, had been courting Charity and talking about giving up the road for love. Each family Sarah contacted had received the same explanation. Their son had found better opportunities elsewhere, had decided to start fresh in a new territory, but none had taken their possessions. None had written home, and none had collected wages owed to them. Mrs. Patterson, whose boy Samuel had disappeared the previous winter, broke down crying when Sarah mentioned his name. He was going to bring her to meet me, she sobbed, clutching a worn handkerchief. Said he'd found the woman he wanted to marry, one of them Hartwell sisters, a good Christian woman who could help him settle down proper. I kept waiting for that letter, saying he was married and happy, but it never came. The most disturbing revelation came from elderly Mr. Kowalski, whose nephew Peter had vanished in the spring. "The boy left all his money with me for safekeeping," he whispered, glancing around his small cabin as if the walls might have ears. Said he was going to propose to that Faith woman. Wanted to have something to offer her father for her hand. But there ain't no father, is there? Just them 3 sisters living alone out there like witches in a fairy tale? Sarah's investigation drew attention she hadn't expected. On Thursday afternoon, as she left the general store after speaking with the proprietor about missing customer accounts, Sheriff Coleman intercepted her on the wooden sidewalk. He was a large man with kind eyes and graying whiskers. Someone she'd known since childhood as her father's friend and poker partner. "Sarah, honey, I'm hearing you've been asking a lot of questions around town," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know you're grieving your daddy, but stirring up old worries isn't going to bring him back. Some of the families you've been talking to are getting upset, having their grief reopened like old wounds." "Sheriff Coleman?" 35 men have disappeared from this town," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear crawling up her spine. "My father documented every case. Don't you think that deserves some investigation?" Coleman's expression hardened slightly. "Your father was a good man, but he saw conspiracies where there were just coincidences. Men move on, Sarah, especially unmarried men, with no ties to hold them. This is hard country, and sometimes folks just decide they want something different." "What about their belongings, their wages, their promises to family?" Sarah pressed. The sheriff was already shaking his head. "I won't have you disrupting this community with wild theories," he said. And though his tone remained paternal, there was steel underneath. "Your daddy's reputation was sterling, and I'd hate to see it tarnished by his daughter chasing ghosts. Maybe it's time you headed back to St. Louis, back to your teaching. Let sleeping dogs lie." The warning was unmistakable. But Sarah had inherited more than her father's sense of justice. She'd inherited his stubborn streak too. That evening she made her way to Murphy's Tavern, where old Pete Hansen could usually be found nursing a bottle of whiskey and mumbling to anyone who'd listen. Pete was the town drunk, a former railroad worker who'd lost his job and his family to alcohol. But he'd always been harmless. just a broken man trying to forget whatever demons chased him through his dreams. She found him in his usual corner, staring into his glass with bloodshot eyes. When she sat down across from him and mentioned the missing men, his head snapped up with surprising alertness. "You're the judge's girl," he slurred, but his eyes were sharp now, calculating. "Heard you've been asking questions about them boys. What disappeared? Did you know any of them, Pete?" Sarah asked quietly, sliding a fresh bottle across the scarred wooden table. Pete's hand shook as he poured himself another drink. And when he spoke, his voice dropped to a whisper that made Sarah lean forward to hear him. "Saw 3 of them at the Hartwell place, Morrison, Webb, and that Garrett fellow working around the property like they was living there permanent. But that was months after folks said they'd left town." Sarah's heart began to race. What were they doing there? Hard to say from a distance, but they looked wrong somehow. It's thin, like they wasn't eating regular, and they moved slow like sick men. Or he paused, taking another drink, like broken men. "I heard screaming one night coming from that direction. Not the kind of screaming you hear from pleasure, if you catch my meaning. The kind that comes from pain or fear." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Sarah whispered. Old Pete's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Tell who? Sheriff Coleman warned me years ago to stay away from that property. Said the sisters had protection from folks who matter. Your pod tried to help, God rest his soul, but some folks got too much power in this town. The sisters got their remedies, their special cures for lonely hearts and empty wombs. Half the town's beholden to them for one thing or another." When Sarah pressed him for more details, Pete sobered up quickly, his eyes darting toward the tavern's other patrons. "I've said too much already. You best be careful, judge's daughter or not. Some secrets in this town got teeth and they bite back when you poke at 'em too hard." That night, Sarah returned to her father's journal with new understanding, reading between the lines of his careful documentation. Hidden in the back pages, she found an entry that made her blood run cold. Her own name, written in her father's shaking hand. "Must protect Sarah. If something happens to me, she'll be the only one brave enough to see this through. God help her, for I fear she'll need divine protection against the evil that has taken root in our midst." The moon was nothing but a sliver when Sarah made her way through the woods toward the Hartwell property, her father's old hunting rifle clutched in trembling hands. She'd spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with her conscience, knowing that what she was about to do crossed every line of proper behavior for a respectable woman. But respectability had failed 35 men. And Sarah was beginning to understand that sometimes justice required abandoning the comfort of social conventions. The Hartwell sisters lived on 40 acres of inherited land 3 miles from town, where Willow Creek wound through a natural depression in the hills. Local legend claimed the spring there had mystical properties. Cherokee had considered it sacred ground before white settlers drove them west. The sisters' cabin sat on a rise overlooking the water. But it was the Springhouse that drew Sarah's attention, a substantial stone building that seemed far too elaborate for its supposed purpose of keeping dairy products cool. Sarah approached through the treeline, grateful for the darkness that concealed her movement, but cursing it when roots and fallen branches threatened to send her sprawling. The cabin windows glowed with lamplight, and she could see shadows moving inside. At least 2 of the sisters were awake despite the late hour. But it was the Springhouse that called to her, its windows casting strange, flickering light across the clearing. Moving closer, Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall and peered through a gap in the wooden shutters. What she saw made her stomach lurch with horror and disbelief. The interior had been converted into Thur. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that reflected the lamplight like a cat's. I got lost," Sarah stammered. But Faith's knowing smile told her the lie fooled no one. "Lost in carrying your father's rifle. How unfortunate. But since you're here, why don't you come inside for tea and conversation? I suspect you have questions that need answering, and I find honesty so much more refreshing than the polite lies most people prefer." Faith's tone was conversational, almost friendly, but the gun never wavered from its aim at Sarah's chest. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Sarah found herself following Faith into the Springhouse. Inside, the smell hit her immediately. Unwashed bodies, fear, sweat, and something else. Something organic and wrong that made her gag. Faith lit several more lamps, revealing the full scope of the horror. The beds weren't empty, after all. 3 men lay on the straw mattresses so thin and broken that Sarah had initially mistaken them for piles of rags. "Allow me to introduce our guests," Faith said with macabre politeness. "Thomas Garrett, whom you've been asking about so persistently, James Morrison, the timber cutter, and Daniel Webb, the merchant with such grand dreams of marriage and prosperity." The men didn't respond to their names, didn't even seem to register Sarah's presence. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing with the empty gaze of cattle. Sarah's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto a wooden crate that served as a chair. "What have you done to them?" Faith settled herself primly on another crate, the gun still trained on Sarah, but her manner now almost maternal. "We've provided them with purpose, Miss McKenna. These men came to us lonely and lost, seeking love and companionship. We've given them something far more valuable, the chance to serve a higher calling. They help maintain our property, provide for our needs, and most importantly, they contribute to the continuation of our bloodline." The clinical way Faith spoke about it was somehow worse than screaming threats would have been. "You're keeping them as slaves," Sarah whispered. "Such an ugly word," Faith chided gently. "We prefer to think of ourselves as gardeners, tending to souls that might otherwise wither and die without proper care. Look at them, Miss McKenna. Are they not happier here with purpose and shelter than wandering aimlessly through a world that had no place for them?" Sarah forced herself to look at the 3 men, searching for any sign of the people they had been. Thomas Garrett had been described as cheerful and hard-working, always ready with a joke for his fellow boarders. The thing lying on the mattress bore no resemblance to that description. Hollow cheeks, dead eyes, limbs that trembled with malnutrition, or worse. "How?" Sarah's voice cracked on the single word. "Herbs have many uses beyond healing," Faith explained, with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow pupil. "Certain combinations can calm an agitated mind, reduce the will to resist, make a person more amenable to suggestion. Combined with proper isolation and careful management of hope and despair, even the strongest man can be molded into a more useful form. My sisters and I have perfected the process over many years." "The community knows," Sarah said, though even as she spoke, she realized how naive the statement sounded. Faith's laugh was genuinely amused. "The community benefits Miss McKenna. Charity delivers their babies and tends their illnesses with skills no doctor could match. Hope provides comfort to their lonely widows and unmarried daughters with her gift for listening and understanding. And I ensure that their leaders remain prosperous and content through my knowledge of beneficial investments and profitable ventures. In return, they ask no uncomfortable questions about our private affairs." Sarah struggled to comprehend the scope of the conspiracy. The sheriff, the reverend, the mayor, they all know what you're doing here. They know what they need to know and ignore what they must ignore, Faith said with a shrug. "It's arrangement that has served everyone well. These men were strangers, drifters with no families to miss them seriously. Their disappearance causes no real hardship to anyone who matters, while their contribution to our household serves the greater good of the entire community. The casual dismissal of human life, the reduction of men to breeding stock, the complicity of an entire town in unspeakable crimes, it all crashed over Sarah like a physical blow. She doubled over, retching helplessly, as the full horror of what she'd discovered overwhelmed her capacity to process it. When she could finally speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "My father knew all of this." "Your father was a moral man trapped in an immoral situation," Faith said with something approaching sympathy. "He understood the consequences of disrupting our arrangement, but lacked the courage to act decisively. His conscience tormented him, which I suppose makes him more admirable than the others, but also more dangerous. We were sorry to learn of his sudden death, though perhaps it was a mercy for everyone involved." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You killed him." Faith's expression remained serene. "Your father died of natural causes, Miss McKenna. A weak heart," the doctor said. "Stress and overwork. Tragic, but hardly unusual for a man of his age and responsibilities." The words were carefully chosen, technically truthful, but loaded with terrible meaning. Sarah stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating horror of the Springhouse, but Faith's voice stopped her. "You have a choice to make now, Miss McKenna. You can follow your father's example, struggle with your conscience until it destroys you, or you can choose wisdom over righteousness. Return to St. Louis, resume your teaching career, and allow Copper Hollow to maintain the peace and prosperity we've all worked so hard to build." Sarah didn't answer. Couldn't answer. She ran into the darkness, branches tearing at her dress and face as she fled through the woods toward town. Behind her, Faith's voice carried on the night air with chilling finality. "Remember, Miss McKenna, some truths are too dangerous for the people who discover them." Sarah didn't sleep that night, couldn't even lie still on her childhood bed without seeing those three broken men staring at nothing with dead eyes. By morning, she'd made her decision. She would take what she'd witnessed to Sheriff Coleman, demand action, force the community to confront the horror festering in their midst like an infected wound. Surely once people understood the scope of the crimes, the systematic torture and enslavement happening just 3 miles from their homes, they would rally behind justice regardless of the sisters' past services. She found Coleman at his office, feet propped on his desk as he worked through a stack of minor complaints and property disputes. When Sarah burst through the door, still wearing yesterday's torn dress with leaves in her hair, he looked up with the weary expression of a man who'd been expecting this confrontation. "I know what they're doing," Sarah said without preamble. "I saw the Springhouse, saw the men they're keeping there. Thomas Garrett is alive, Sheriff. So are James Morrison and Daniel Webb. They're being held captive, drugged, tortured." "Sarah, stop." Coleman's voice cut through her words like a blade. "You're telling me you trespassed on private property in the middle of the night, armed with a rifle to spy on 3 respectable women?" He stood slowly, his bulk filling the small office. "That's a serious crime, young lady. Breaking and entering, threatening behavior, disturbing the peace." "They have 3 men chained in that building," Sarah insisted. But she could hear how desperate she sounded. How unhinged her claims must seem to someone who hadn't witnessed the horror firsthand. "They're using them as breeding stock, keeping them drugged and broken." Enough. Coleman slammed his hand on the desk hard enough to make the inkwell jump. "I will not listen to wild accusations against women who've served this community faithfully for 20 years. The Hartwell sisters deliver babies, tend the sick, provide healing when doctors are too far away or too expensive. Your evidence consists of trespassing and whatever fevered imaginings you cooked up in the dark." Sarah stared at him, seeing the truth written in every line of his face. He knew. Maybe not the full scope of it, maybe not every horrific detail, but he knew something was wrong at the Hartwell property and had chosen to ignore it. "My father documented 35 disappearances," she said quietly. "Your father was a sick man in his final months," Coleman replied, and there was genuine sadness in his voice now. Seeing threats where none existed, spinning conspiracy theories from coincidence and bad luck. "I won't let his memory be tarnished by his daughter's hysterics." From Coleman's office, Sarah went to Mayor Hutchinson, prosperous merchant who'd known her family for years. He received her in his store's back office, surrounded by ledgers and inventory lists that spoke of a community's quiet prosperity. When she laid out her accusations, he listened with the patience of a man accustomed to hearing complaints, but his response chilled her more than Coleman's anger had. "Miss McKenna, I understand you're grieving and looking for someone to blame for your father's death," Hutchinson said gently, "but consider what you're suggesting. The Hartwell sisters have delivered over 100 babies in this county, saved countless lives with their remedies, provided medical care to families who couldn't afford a doctor's visit. Are you telling me we should destroy 3 women who VA devoted their lives to healing because some drifters decided to move on without saying goodbye?" "They're not gone," Sarah insisted. "They're being held prisoner." "Where's your proof?" Hutchinson interrupted. "Real proof, not nighttime trespassing and wild theories. If these men are really being held captive, where are the screams neighbors should hear? Where are the signs of struggle, the attempts to escape? You're re-asking me to believe that 3 middle-aged spinsters have somehow overpowered and imprisoned dozens of grown men without anyone in this close-knit community noticing anything amiss?" The worst part was that his questions made sense. How could such crimes happen without more obvious evidence? How could an entire community remain ignorant of systematic torture occurring in their midst? Sarah found herself doubting what she'd seen with her own eyes, wondering if grief and stress had somehow warped her perception of reality. Her final attempt was with the families themselves, the people who should have been most desperate for answers about their missing sons. But even here, she encountered a wall of resistance, that made her question everything she thought she understood about human nature. Mrs. Patterson, whose son Samuel had vanished the previous winter, received Sarah in her kitchen with barely concealed hostility. "Told you before, Miss McKenna. Samuel found work elsewhere," she said firmly. "I've been getting money regular like sent from someone who knew him enough to keep me comfortable to fix the roof and buy medicine for my arthritis. Why would I want to upset that arrangement by chasing after ghosts?" The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're being paid to stay quiet about your son's disappearance. I'm being helped by someone with a generous heart," Mrs. Patterson corrected sharply. "Samuel always said he'd take care of me in my old age, and somehow he's managing to do just that. I woe and have his memory disturbed by wild accusations from someone who's been away too long to understand how things work in this town." Similar conversations with other families revealed the same pattern. Anonymous financial support that had begun shortly after each disappearance, enough to ease the burden of losing a breadwinner, but not enough to raise questions about its source. The sisters had bought silence not through fear alone, but through carefully calculated charity, making themselves indispensable to the very people who should have been demanding justice. By the end of the week, Sarah was completely isolated. Shopkeepers served her with cold politeness. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid conversation, and even Mrs. Henderson had stopped her daily visits with casseroles and gossip. Worse, she began hearing whispers about her father's final months, suggestions that his journal represented the delusions of a man whose mind had been failing long before his heart gave out. The sisters' supporters were systematically destroying his reputation to protect themselves, and Sarah was powerless to stop it. Sitting in her father's study on Sunday evening, staring at his portrait above the fireplace, Sarah seriously considered giving up. She could return to St. Louis, resume her teaching career, try to forget what she'd discovered in that stone building by the spring. The community had made their choice, prioritizing comfort and prosperity over the lives of men they considered disposable. What right did she have to impose her moral standards on people who found a way to live with their compromises? It was then that she noticed something odd about her father's desk. One of the drawers seemed shorter than the others, as if it didn't extend all the way to the back of the frame. Running her hands along the interior, she found a hidden catch that released a false back panel. Inside was a sealed envelope with her name written in her father's careful script. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered the truth about our community's darkest secret. I know the burden this knowledge places on your shoulders, and I know how alone you must feel as you face the weight of willful blindness that surrounds you. But you are not alone, my dear daughter, and justice delayed is not justice denied as long as someone remembers." The letter went on to reveal that her father had been corresponding with U.S. Marshal Thomas Reed in Springfield, part of a federal investigation into similar cases of local corruption protecting heinous crimes. He had been methodically building a case that would bypass the compromised local authorities, gathering evidence and documentation that would force federal intervention. "I was too much a coward to act while I lived," the letter continued. "But I have prepared the way for someone braver than myself. In the hidden compartment beneath this one, you will find copies of all my correspondence with Marshal Reed, along with detailed evidence of the sisters' crimes and the community's complicity. You are my legacy, Sarah. Finish what I started, and let the dead finally find their justice." The second hidden compartment contained a treasure trove of evidence that made Sarah's hands shake as she sorted through it. Her father had been far more thorough than she'd realized. Detailed maps of the Hartwell property, sketches of the Springhouse interior, copies of correspondence with families in 3 neighboring counties who'd reported similar disappearances, and most importantly, a thick folder marked Federal Investigation. Marshal T. read. The letters between her father and the federal marshal painted a picture of a methodical investigation that had been building for over a year, with Copper Hollow serving as the focal point of a wider pattern of corruption and complicity. Marshal Reed's most recent letter, dated just a week before her father's death, made the scope of the investigation clear. "Judge McKenna, your documentation has been invaluable in connecting similar cases across Missouri and Arkansas. We've identified at least 6 communities where local authorities have failed to investigate mysterious disappearances involving unmarried transient workers. The pattern you've uncovered in Copper Hollow appears to be part of a larger network of exploitation that requires federal intervention. I will arrive with the team within the month to begin formal proceedings." Sarah spent the next 3 days copying her father's journal and adding her own witness testimony to the pile of evidence, including detailed descriptions of what she'd seen in the Springhouse and the community's systematic efforts to silence investigation. When she finally rode to Springfield to meet with Marshall Reed, she carried documentation that painted an undeniable picture of organized crime protected by local corruption. Marshall Thomas. Reed was a lean man in his 50s with steel-gray eyes and the quiet competence of someone accustomed to dealing with humanity's darkest impulses. He received Sarah in his office with the courtesy due a judge's daughter. But his manner became grimly professional as he reviewed the evidence she presented. "Miss McKenna, what you and your father have documented here represents one of the most systematic cases of human trafficking and community complicity we've encountered," Reed said after spending 2 hours examining the materials. "The scope of the conspiracy, the duration of the crimes, the number of victims, this requires immediate federal action." "How long before you can move against them?" Sarah asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We'll need 2 weeks to assemble the proper team and coordinate with state authorities," Reed replied. "This isn't just about arresting 3 women. We'll need to document the entire network of complicity, gather additional evidence, prepare for the legal battle that's certain to follow. Communities don't surrender their secrets easily, even when faced with federal authority." Those 2 weeks felt like the longest of Sarah's life. She remained in Copper Hollow, knowing that leaving might alert the sisters to federal attention, but living under the constant weight of knowing that 3 men remained captive just miles away. Worse, the community's hostility toward her continued to escalate. Someone threw stones at her father's house, shattering to windows. The pharmacist refused to fill a prescription for her headache powders. Even the pastor pointedly excluded her from his Sunday prayers for the community's well-being. On a gray October morning, Marshall Reed arrived with a team of 6 federal agents and a warrant signed by a federal judge in St. Louis. Sarah watched from her father's front porch as the small convoy of official wagons made their way through town, drawing curious stares and nervous whispers from townspeople who'd never seen federal law enforcement in their quiet community. The raid on the Hartwell property was swift and methodical. Unlike the local authorities, who might have been swayed by personal relationships or community pressure, the federal agents approached their task with professional detachment. They found exactly what Sarah's testimony had prepared them for. 3 severely malnourished men in various states of psychological breakdown. A substantial collection of restraints and drug paraphernalia and detailed records kept by the sisters documenting their victims' training and breeding schedule. The sisters themselves offered no resistance, facing arrest with an eerie calm that suggested they'd been prepared for this possibility. Faith Hartwell's final words to Marshall Reed, spoken as the manacles closed around her wrists, were chillingly matter-of fact. "You're destroying something that worked, Marshall. This community was prosperous and peaceful because we provided services they needed. When we're gone, you'll see what your federal justice actually accomplishes." The immediate aftermath was chaos. 2 of the rescued men, Thomas Garrett and James Morrison, were so psychologically damaged that they couldn't initially be separated from their captors without becoming violent. The 3rd, Daniel Webb, had moments of lucidity, where he recognized his own name, but couldn't remember his life before captivity. All 3 required immediate medical attention and would need months of careful treatment before they could testify coherently about their experiences. The community's reaction was swift and vicious. Within days of the arrests, Sarah found herself completely ostracized. Shopkeepers refused her business. The post office claimed to have no mail for her. Someone painted betrayer across her father's front door in red letters that looked disturbingly like blood. Mayor Hutchinson, facing his own federal investigation for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, publicly blamed Sarah for bringing outside interference to a community that had been managing its own affairs successfully for decades. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Sheriff Coleman was arrested for obstruction of justice and failure to investigate reported crimes. Reverend Mills faced charges for conspiracy and received testimony linking him to active discouragement of families trying to report their sons missing. 3 prominent businessmen who received financial benefits from investments recommended by Faith Hartwell were charged with accessory after the fact, most painfully for Sarah. The trials revealed that several families had known far more about their sons' fates than they had admitted. Mrs. Patterson broke down under federal questioning and confessed that she suspected Samuel was being held against his will, but had convinced herself that the monthly payments were worth more than his freedom. He was never going to amount to much anyway, she sobbed to the federal prosecutor. At least this way, he was finally useful for something. By the time the trials concluded in the spring of 1874, Sarah had accepted a position with Marshal Reed's office, traveling to communities across the Midwest to investigate similar cases of local corruption protecting systematic crimes. The work was dangerous and lonely, taking her to places where federal authority was viewed with suspicion, and witnesses often disappeared before they could testify. Odd. But it gave her a purpose that honored her father's memory. On the morning she finally left Copper Hollow for good, Sarah made 2 final stops. The first was at her father's grave, where she placed a bouquet of wildflowers and spoke words that only the dead could hear. "It's finished, Papa. The truth came to light, just as you said it would. It cost everything, but justice was worth the price." Her second stop was at the small cemetery plot where the bodies of identified victims had been buried with simple wooden markers paid for by the federal investigation. Sarah planted wildflowers on each grave. 35 small acts of remembrance for men whose names had been forgotten by everyone, except the daughter of a judge who refused to let their suffering remain hidden. As she worked in the morning sun, she could see Copper Hollow spread out below her. A community forever changed by the consequences of choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. The town would survive, might even prosper again someday, but it would never again be able to claim the innocence that had allowed such horrors to flourish in its midst.